I'd like to introduce our speaker, lawyer and author Lwando Xaso. Lwando is the granddaughter of Skhumbuzo Xaso, a messenger at a law firm under apartheid South Africa, who grew up to become a lawyer, which was not only her grandfather's dream, but her dream since she was 12 years old. Today, she is not only a writer and a speaker, but founder of Including Society, a forum which aims to support private and public institutions and companies in their quest to create a culture more aligned with the South African Constitution. In 2011, she worked under Justice Edwin Cameron at the Constitutional Court and contributed to the book One Law, One Nation. She frequently writes on topics of constitutional law, history, and culture for various publications, and recently published her book Made in South Africa, A Black Woman's Stories of Rage, Resistance, and Progress. In 2012, she was awarded the Franklin Thomas Fellowship to study at the University of Notre Dame and received a master's in international law, graduating magna cum laude. She was a researcher for Chief Justice Andile Ngobo. Currently, she works within the Constitutional Trust, primarily on projects such as the Museum of the Constitution at Constitution Hill. She's the founder of Including Society, a forum established to explore issues around cultural justice, belonging, and inclusion, all very topical for our unit of students and the project we are working on. Lwando has an embodied ability to see the world through a lens of social justice. She will share her insights on the law and spatial justice and unpack ideas around spatial inclusion. We will have some time for questions after, but now I will hand over to Lwando. Lwando, if you want to share your screen, please.
Just to say good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this talk. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Nabil, for such a generous introduction. I really wish we were doing this in person, but alas. Okay, so we can get started. Nabil has already given you a bit of my history. My name is Lwando, and yes, I'm a lawyer by profession. I have practiced mostly in the private sector, but I've had my stints in the public sector as well, which includes the Constitutional Court. I'm no longer a practicing lawyer in the corporate sense. I now run Including Society, which is a business that's dedicated to reimagining culture of private spaces and how best they can reflect the values and transformative mission of the South African Constitution. You know, how corporate spaces, private spaces can be more transparent, open, and embracing of all people. One of the most transformative experiences in my working life was clerking at the Constitutional Court. I remember visiting the court as a child during a school visit. It was in an office park complex. I'll show you that building later on in the presentation. I was so uninspired. I mean, at that point, I already knew I wanted to be a lawyer, and I was so excited to visit the court. But once I visited the building, you know, I almost let go of my dream to be a lawyer. It wasn't inspiring to me. So by the time I clocked at the court, it was in its current building that most of you know, and which I'm going to share today, which is its permanent home. And it made such a lasting impression on me when I clocked there. You know, it actually inspired me to establish Including Society. I felt that that court building saw me. I felt that it was thoughtful, it was intentional, and I think it reinforced what we were trying to do with the law in this constitutional democracy. It mirrored the kind of society that we were trying to build using the law. So shortly after my time at the court, I went back to private practice. I went back to the Sandton skyscrapers and the high rises and the glossy buildings that sought to impress and lord over rather than to embrace. If someone would airdrop, you know, another person in Sandton and they open their eyes, like a person that didn't know which continent they were on, there's nothing about these buildings that lets them know that they are on the African continent. So I transitioned from the space, the Constitutional Court, which is very particular, very considered, and very intentional, to one that was very detached from South Africa, South Africa's present and its past, and also detached from the constitutional vision. Architecture can reveal the priorities of those who build buildings. You know, it can give us insight into the agendas of those who imagine these buildings. One of the quotes that I like is, "Architecture is the alphabet of giants. It is the largest set of symbols ever made to meet the eyes of men. A tower stands up like a sort of simplified statue of much more than heroic size." That's how these skyscrapers in Sandton felt to me. They felt like statues, and they felt rather imposing. We have to strain our necks gazing upwards at these buildings. We are obsessed with bigger, better, taller, shinier. The building I worked in at the time felt like a statement of our capitalist ambitions through its architecture, which is, I think, a legacy of our colonial past, you know, materialism and capitalism. If you want to know what corporate lawyers think of themselves, look at their buildings. I started thinking, what would happen if we use the Constitutional Court as a blueprint? What lessons can we learn from the court and how spaces can facilitate the making of community and belonging? The court stands today as one of the most trusted arms of the state, and that's because of the integrity and the trust that it has engendered from the general public. And a big part of that trust, the way that it was engendered, is how it built its permanent home and what that home now looks like and what it says to people. The court became the Constitutional Court became very necessary because our judicial system in South Africa has long been tainted by colonialism and apartheid. And I just want to take this time to go back to this colonial past and to apartheid, just so we can appreciate, you know, why the Constitutional Court looks and feels the way that it does today. Sorry. Our legal system has its humble and problematic beginnings in the small refreshment station established by the Dutch East India Company in the Cape in 1652. The first court of justice met in a hall in the center of the commander's earthenwork fort. The setting was described as exotic. Round the walls hung skins of lions and leopards and the polished horns of slain buck, whilst opposite the entrance stood the figure of a stuffed zebra. Typical African icons, images, or patterns as imagined by the white imagination of Africa. Its colonial lens of what an African space should look like. And I represented that with this image here of African taxidermy, which according to the descriptions of this first court, is what the space would have looked like. After the Dutch occupation of the Cape came British colonization. In 1814, there was pressure from British merchants to open up the court proceedings to the general public. So with that, they needed more space and a new building. The existing room in Cape Town was found to be too small to accommodate spectators. The site chosen for a new and larger building was the yard of a former government slave lodge. I imagine that the history of the site was erased to make way for the new court building. So this idea that you can transform a former slave lodge into a court is something that, sorry, I'm echoing. Is the sound okay?
It's fine now, Lwando. There was just a moment of echo.
Okay. So the idea of building a court on a site that was a slave lodge is something that is almost replicated with the building of the Constitutional Court on a site that was a military fort and a prison. But the approach was very different. I think that with the slave lodge, there was no thought behind how to carry the memory of the slave lodge and how to honor the history of that site. So it was carelessly done, and the new court was duly completed. And at its opening ceremony in 1815, the Chief Justice declared that it had been erected with great expense, just to note the kind of money that had been put into the building. And it was built to give the colony an external luster. So its appearance was more important than how it felt. Then I want to move on to another historical site when it comes to our judicial system, and that's the Palace of Justice in Pretoria. It's another significant court building in our country. Even its name, the Palace of Justice, denotes an imperial residence, not a palace, not a place of community or democratic deliberation or gathering, but the pinnacle of undemocratic power as represented by royalty and those who are above society, the symbol of foreign imposed rule and exclusion and the idea of inherited power. It is in the palace where the people's power often collided with the state power. So for those of you who don't know, the Palace of Justice is that court where Nelson Mandela was actually sentenced to life imprisonment. It dates back to 1897. It was designed by a Dutch architect, and it's a monument to colonial opulence with an eclectic Dutch and Italian influences. The inside of the Palace of Justice boasts British floor tiles, a Dutch stained glass ceiling, ornate lamps, carved dark wood for the judges, and a jury box with red leather seats that has been vacant since the South African jury system was abolished in 1969. The design and construction of the building during the 1890s coincided with a constitutional crisis in the then Zuid-Afrikaanse Republic that led to a far-reaching constitutional transformation and eventually resulted in the South African War, the Second Anglo-Boer War between 1899 and 1902, the war between the British and the Afrikaners, and the establishment of the Union of South Africa at the exclusion of the majority of the country. Of interest here is that while the Palace of Justice was being built, the military fort, which would later become the home of the Constitutional Court, was also being established. In the bowels of the Palace of Justice is an austere corridor leading to the holding cells where political prisoners such as Nelson Mandela were detained. It's quoted in graffiti by generations of political prisoners. You know, the walls are peeling at the moment and they bear the messages of protest. There comes a time in the life of any nation where only two choices remain, whether to submit or fight. Those are just some of the messages that you can read in those holding cells which lie beneath the Palace of Justice. So it's amazing how the palace is so grand, you know, but underneath, you know, the brutality, you know, all these pillars that we see, the gold and the dark wood and all of that, you know, what belies that is this, you know, oppression of people, you know, beneath the structure. Just to move on to another significant court building in Pretoria again is the Old Synagogue. It was actually it was designed in 1897 to resemble the architectural traditions of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Old Synagogue was the first Jewish house of worship to be consecrated in Pretoria. This was until 1952 when the government transformed the synagogue into a Supreme Court complex. A point of interest in how these colonial court buildings felt to Black people is this moment in 1962 when Nelson Mandela appeared in the Old Synagogue court as an accused. And this ornate synagogue was characterized by its sandstone plinth, colored brickwork, as well as its stained glass and top and hung windows. And there was Nelson Mandela appearing wearing a kaross, his traditional Xhosa clothing, as if to bring an element of Africanness to this foreign setting. He decided that he was going to represent himself in that trial of 1962. And he made a statement from the dock, which is something that was almost a political standpoint at the time, not to plead guilty or innocent, but to share a statement from the dock as if to put apartheid on trial. And this is some of what he said. during his address to the court. He said, "I feel oppressed by the atmosphere of white domination that lurks all around in this courtroom. Somehow, this atmosphere calls to mind the inhumane injustices that caused my people outside this courtroom by the same white domination. In this country, there is only a white court. This is not the type of atmosphere most conducive to feelings of security and confidence in the impartiality of a court." So I found that striking because that speech, by the way, is called "A Black Man in a White Man's Court." And he's talking about not feeling at ease in this colonial court and feeling that the atmosphere that is created in that courtroom, you have a white prosecutor, you have a white judge, you know, you have a white orderly who brings you up from the bowels of the court to the dock where you make your address. And also you have separate seating for Black people. And the fact that even in its look and feel, didn't feel African. And in terms of its proceedings, you know, how its proceedings were conducted did not feel African. And there he shows up wearing his traditional clothing to make the statement saying, "I do not feel secure or confident in this courtroom." In my mind, he's almost imagining what an African court would look like and feel like. This brings me to this idea of white spaces. You know, what the Palace of Justice and the Old Synagogue represent, you know, are white spaces. Colonial spaces are white spaces that served as spaces for Black disempowerment. White spaces were made in the image of the apartheid states of its national identity and ideology. Dutch and British with remnants of the Roman Empire. By white, I mean that the white ownership of power, real estate, and economic prosperity was symbolized by the sterile and intimidating architecture that we see. In the white space, we experience the hypervisibility and invisibility of the Black body. Invisibility in how all Black accused look the same to the white gaze. You know, it also the white body is overshadowed by the grandeur of the building, a building that does not see them, that does not represent them or their culture. Hypervisibility in the sense of an othered body, you know, which is transformed into a spectacle in the white space. In the same way that I imagine that Nelson Mandela in his Karos was transformed into a spectacle in that colonial courtroom. This coloring or racializing of space occurs through the placement of monuments, artworks, the naming of buildings, streets, and campuses, the style or aesthetics of spaces, as well as the representation of spaces in culture or within a cultural imagination. The coloring of space with symbols that remind us of past oppression and racism can perpetuate feelings of being an outsider. Similar to how students felt, you know, during Rhodes Must Fall, you know, how a statue of Cecil John Rhodes at UCT felt some students, left students feeling like outsiders. The court as white spaces had to be transformed with the advent of our constitutional democracy. The constitutional court had to embody a decolonial space for its own credibility as an institution of change. I just like this quote: "The decolonization of buildings and public spaces is not a frivolous issue, especially in a country that for many centuries has defined itself as not of Africa, but as an outpost of European imperialism on the dark continent, and in which 70% of the land is still firmly in the hands of 13% of the population. The decolonization of buildings and of public spaces is inseparable from the democratization of access." So I think, you know, this quote sort of reminds me that the Constitutional Court was the first sort of decolonial imagining of what a public space could look and feel like. You know, at that point of our transition, the executive, our president, our ministers, and the legislature, our parliament of the new South Africa were originally and are still housed in buildings inherited from the colonial past. The new Constitutional Court building was the first major public building to be erected in the young democratic state. Not surprisingly, this building project was immediately embraced as a unique opportunity to, I think, physically dramatize the transformation of South Africa from a racist society to a constitutional democracy. You know, when the court was being built, the judges had one question for the designers. And that question was, having regard to how the legal system in South Africa has been used to oppress people, you know, how do we put a smiling face on the justice system? And I think that's such a profound question. And you will see how the designers answered that question. So the court plays a significant role in our legal transition. The design of a new constitutional court building during the late 1990s provided the new South African state with its first opportunity to refashion the public image of the democratic legal system. Everybody involved in the process understood the symbolic importance of this project. When the Constitutional Court heard its first case on the 15th of February 1995, it was housed in prime commercial office space in Braamfontein, which had been temporarily leased and converted for this purpose. You know, from the Dutch and colonial perspective, this would have been close to the ideal location of the highest court in a young democratic state. So this was the building that I visited, you know, when I first visited the court, it was to this building in Braamfontein. And as you can see, there was nothing inspiring about it. And yeah, as you know, as I said earlier, it's probably the kind of building you would expect a colonial court to be in. However, the judges felt that from the outset that the office block was an inappropriate setting for the court, and they immediately started exploring other alternatives. And they finally settled on the old fort prison. It was once a military fort where the South African War was fought, the Second Anglo-Boer War was fought, and it then became a prison thereafter, and it was chosen in 1998 as the permanent home of the Constitutional Court. It was chosen because of its history. You know, the paradox of placing what represents the pinnacle of justice in South Africa, the highest court in the land, on a site that was known for the worst human rights abuses, was really poetic to the judges, and it really articulated the message that they wanted to share with the world, that in South Africa, you know, we are transforming former symbols of oppression and colonialism into symbols of the future, you know, into symbols of inclusion, of transformation. And, you know, for that reason, the site is actually called a light on the hill. The Old Fort Prison in the minds of many South Africans actually is synonymous with brutal oppression by the apartheid state and the long and difficult struggle against it. And the reason I say that is that today, the court is still a site of struggle, that although we're not fighting against an apartheid state, a lot of people approach that court as the setting for making our constitution real. Physical space is more decisive in creating community than we realize. You know, most courts are designed for control and intimidation. The Constitutional Court is very humble in its appearance. It allows people to feel at home, and it provides a gathering space for a lot of people who want to express themselves, whether it's outside the court, as you can see here, with the people wearing purple t-shirts, or a gathering place inside of the courtroom itself, which you can see on the right. You know, as I said, it is built on a former prison site, and prisons are defined by the way in which they restrict movement. You know, and by contrast, as you can see, this is almost a view of the entire site. This is the court right here. And this is the old building where the court used to be. So it's almost facing its history, its humble beginnings in this office complex. And the prison cells would be on the right here and on the other side of Constitution Hill as well. So having that history of a place that restricted movement in the form of a military fort and of a prison, you know, by contrast, this new building is defined by the way in which it is situated, you know, on an inner city street that draws people from previously separated communities into movement through the urban precinct. So if you've ever been to Constitution Hill, you know, a lot of people just cut across this, what we now call a human rights precinct, whether to, you know, get into town, which is through Constitution Hill, or to get into other neighborhoods like Hillbrow, which is on the other side. So there's always human traffic and there's always movement. So I would say movement, or the street, is one of the themes of the precinct. The other theme is accessibility. The court precinct has no main entrance. Visitors can choose how they want to enter and where they can enter from. And that choice, I think, is a marker of a creative space, of a democratic space. The foyer itself is a place of gathering, and it's a place of light. And it leads me to my other theme of serving as a clearing. The prison complex was very dark, and it feels like you are in the belly of the beast. And by the time you move from the prison cells to the Constitutional Court, it feels like you're in a clearing under the shading of trees of the African bushveld, which serves as a welcoming and protective meeting place. The space also speaks to light and transparency. Apartheid is very much defined by the darkness of our history, in the sense that a lot of what was done under apartheid was done in the dark, whether it's the making of the laws, whether it's people who are being disappeared by the apartheid state. So now this idea of transparency and light is underscored by our constitution. It's actually an imperative. And the building itself, really animates that value of transparency. It responds to its own natural environment through the unique and extensive use of natural light. On the ceiling, it actually has slits that brings in the natural light. And the windows are just generally a sign of life. The people outside who are cutting across the precinct can see what's happening in the court. And the people who work inside the court can see outside, just to make sure that they're not cut off from reality. Sorry. Julian Young writes that, in contrast, modern shopping centers and office parks, such as the buildings that I've worked in Sandton, they are depressing because they block out the ever-changing natural light and replace it with a monotonous and oppressive uniformity of fluorescent light. It's something I know all too well. The foyer of the court lets in light, which tells us that we are in the right place, that we are welcome. And as you can see here, people are provided with benches to sit on. And this allows for casual contact, between people, and it encourages relatedness. While the design of the court is very functional, there's no focus on icons or technology and operational, associations. It's a place rather for democratic gathering and community. I just love this quote as well. The sun illuminates the situation of the helpless, which is usually shrouded in darkness. And a lot of the people who approach the Constitutional Court are people who find themselves in those situations of helplessness. Just to go back to another point about this foyer or this reception place, space, is that I can't imagine a court that doesn't have windows, and when I think back, having visited the High Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal and, many other court buildings, the court is quite unique in the kind of allocation to sort of glass and transparency. And I think that spaces without windows, they block out the larger world that we are attempting to care for as lawyers, as judges. A space with no windows can be taken to mean that the larger world does not exist, and so I think it's such an important theme. And I think that if the court took on the colonial architecture of being very inward looking, focusing narrowly on the smaller world within, within the boundaries of the space itself, I think so much would have been lost in the making of this building. Another aspect of the court that encourages gatherings are the court hallways, which are very wide, and they're actually decked with incredible African art. This picture that I've chosen to represent the hallway, you can't see the hallway, the hallway in its completeness, but this is on Justice Cameron's last day at the court, and he's literally gathering spontaneously in the hallway with law clerks and other people who want to wish him farewell. And I think that wouldn't have been possible if the hallways were narrow. I think Having wide hallways encourages transparency again, and encourages community. I mean, the law clerk's offices are actually along this hallway, and we have wooden shutters that you can open all the way and see out into the hallway. And because of that, I've overheard a lot of interesting conversations, casual conversations amongst the judges. And for me, that makes them so human and relatable. And also it just gives you this old school feeling of being able to pop out your window and say hi to your colleagues. So I think that's another favorite aspect of the court that I think internally on the private side of things encourages community amongst colleagues. The other theme of the site is memorial. The court was conceived as a memorial for the incarcerated victims of apartheid and a memorial of our history of oppression, by being situated in the middle of a notorious apartheid prison. I think this is the true meaning of transformation, in the sense that parts of the demolished parts of the prison complex, the parts that had to be taken down to make space for the Constitutional Court to be built, instead of discarding, those bricks from the demolished parts, those bricks were actually used to build the court itself. And I think what it says is that we cannot truly be a progressive state. We can't be a transformative state if we erase our history, if we do not accept our history. And I think what it also says is, don't allow this very heavy history to weigh you down. Use the bricks of history to build a future, and not just any future, a future that is embodied by our constitutional vision. So I think that this idea of incorporating a piece of our history, into our present spaces is a powerful one and speaks to a deeper sense of transformation. The other theme of the court is symbols. Traditionally, the symbol of justice is Lady Justice, with the scales and the blindfold, and that's inherited from, the Roman Empire. It's not an African symbol of justice. And in building this court, I think the design impetus, the inspiration behind the design of the court as a gathering space for community is embodied by the official emblem of the court, which is justice under a tree, which you see here, of people gathered literally under a tree. That has now become our symbol of justice, which is a reflection of how African communities resolve disputes, not in closed off buildings, but also this idea of a tree being protective of the people, and also the idea of transparency, of having gatherings outside, but more importantly, gathering around a tree means that you form a circle. And a circle represents the geometry of community. If you're sitting in a boardroom and the tables are rectangular, there are people that you lose in your eyesight. You have someone sitting at the head of the table, and that does not encourage community, but sitting in a circle encourages community. And the whole court, the courtroom itself, which I'll show in a later image, is actually built so that the judges are in community with the spectators, the audience, because the bench itself where the judges sit is built in a semicircle, and the room itself is rather curved. So I think that replacing the symbols of the past is very important when we think of what our institutions or buildings should look like. And the other theme is that of inclusion. And the way that the court does that, I just want to mention two ways it does that. It's in multilingualism and in art. So this is the exterior of the court. What you see outside is the official signage saying the Constitutional Court, but it says that in all the official languages, right? And in no particular order, to show that there's equality amongst languages. And also the way that this official font of the court was developed speaks to this idea of inclusion, because the designer of the font actually took graffiti that's on the walls, on the prison cells, and he also took graffiti from Hillbrow, which is a community that a lot of people place at the margins of South Africa. It's a feared community, but this designer went into Hillbrow and as a neighbor of the court, and found graffiti that he then mixed with another handwriting. It was one of the judge's handwritings, Justice Xaso, who's a blind judge who's never written before until the judges were asked to write the 3 pillars of our constitution on the exterior of the court. And those pillars are dignity, freedom, and equality. When they saw Justice Xaso's handwriting, they thought it was so beautiful. They mixed it with the font from the prison cells and from Hillbrow, and they came up with this font. And that for me speaks again to this idea of inclusion of our past, but also including ordinary people, you know, in the fabric of the making of a building. And then the other way that the court achieves this is with its doors. As you can see on the left, wooden doors that have carvings, and those carvings represent the Bill of Rights. You know, we have 27 rights in Chapter 2 of our Constitution, and those are represented on the door in multiple South African languages. And I think it's so important to have a door that represents our diverse country, because so many people from very remote areas of the country arrive at the Constitutional Court, you know, to argue cases of such importance, and to be able to be greeted at the door, you know, in your language is something that is very important and makes you feel included in the space. You know, you have an idea that the space actually sees you and it welcomes you. And then again, you know, I think the other way we can speak to multilingualism is this idea of art as a vernacular. You know, the court has a very impressive art collection which tells South African stories from different vantage points. This artwork is called The Blue Dress, and it tells the story of a freedom fighter, Lwando, who was killed by the South African State Police. And, you know, when she was being tortured by the State Police, she was made to strip naked. And luckily, she found a blue plastic bag that she was able to wear as underwear. And when the artist Judith Mason, who's also passed away, when she heard the story, she was inspired to create a blue dress for Pila, you know, from other blue plastic bags that she found, and she wrote a letter for her on the dress itself. So those kind of stories being told, you know, including those narratives and people who've been forgotten in history is very important in the court's attempt at being multilingual. The last theme I want to talk about is equality. You know, colonial courts, which I represent here with the red seating, you know, they had raised platforms. An elevated bench creates a space for judgment. You know, it's not the seating arrangement for democracy or community. The raised platforms underlies the superiority of the few raised higher than the heads of the many others. You know, it distorts the need for dialogue. Community is built when we sit in a circle and when we sit at eye level to one another. Voices are better heard when we're all on one level. The judges of the Constitutional Court, you know, sit in a circle in the conference room when they're deliberating. And then in the Constitutional Court chamber itself, they make sure that they're not elevated from the counsel who stands behind the lectern here, that the counsel is actually looking them directly in the eye. And if you're sitting in the audience, you know, in that court chamber, you're also looking the judges in the eye. There's no one person who's raised higher than the other. This is a quote from one of the designers, one of the architects of the building, which I think represents, you know, why this court, I think, can be a blueprint for transformation. She says, in a democratic society, civic buildings can either gain their symbolic value by expressing the openness they represent, or they can be monuments to be seen from 20 kilometers away as great domes, towers of light, or some other kind of dominant symbol. Grand dominant monuments are only needed to represent victories of war, exclusivity in the face of threat to an unpopular social system, economic or elite social power, or the unattainable, places of God or the gods. The Constitution, and therefore its house and precinct, have nothing in common with any of these situations. The Constitution represents the opposite, and alternative means should be found to achieve symbolic importance for the building among the citizens of South Africa. So I think that sums up quite nicely the approach of the architects to building this building. You know, the court inspired the term of Ubuntu architecture. It's a building which concerns itself with humaneness and interconnectedness. The transformation of law and adjudication is physically represented in the design of the new Constitutional Court building. You know, it's transparent, it's people-centered, and it's progressive. And I imagine it's the kind of court that Nelson Mandela had in mind in 1962 when he felt like a black man in a white man's court. You know, a full circle moment was him inaugurating the Constitutional Court in 1995, and also his involvement in the building of the court's permanent home at Constitution Hill, a place where he was imprisoned not only once but twice when it was a prison, right? So that full circle moment is watching this place that incarcerated him being turned into, you know, the idea that he had of a constitutional court, knowing that we needed a new court because the other courts had been tainted by our history. So I'm thinking that as it's sitting there, it was a dream realized, knowing that we can start imagining what, you know, an African sense of justice feels like and looks like. And just finally to say, you know, the Constitutional Court reflects the future we want to live into. It serves as a metaphor for the larger community we want to create. You know, if the future does not exist inside of the Constitutional Court building, you know, in the buildings that we all occupy, then the chances are it will remain out of reach. Thank you so much.
Wow, Lwando, thank you. Great to listen to you speak about Constitution Hill Precinct.
A place you know so well.
A place I know so well.
A place where we met.
The place where
we
met.
gathered.
Exactly. In fact, I'm thinking now back to, on the behest of Justice Albie Sachs, when we took Rahul Malhotra, a well-known international architect, and you took himself and the family through the spaces, and what a powerful experience it was. Powerful for me because as architects, we tend to see certain things, certain spaces in certain ways. And your lens, the way you read space through this kind of legal framework, through the history of South Africa, and through this lens, which I was referring to earlier, this kind of lens of humanity and empathy, which is amazing, because I think students and the project we're working on at the moment are so sometimes lost in this kind of world of architecture, because there's kind of magazine architecture, and then there's all the kind of banks and insurance companies that do these huge imposing buildings that intimidate without people knowing it, and people take that kind of glitz and that volume and those atriums as spaces of a kind of like an ambition, an aspiration, without realizing what those spaces are doing to them, that they're belittling them. And for me, it was always a powerful moment when you described the front door of the Concourt, which is actually a thin, tall door. And like you say today, you know, imagine an elderly woman, a gogo, coming from a rural area to the court and touching that door and seeing a language that she understands and entering that space that makes her feel welcome. And this history of this kind of oppressive history of making people feel that they do not belong is so prevalent, so permeated in our everyday of South Africa, in our everyday of Johannesburg.
Even the choice, sorry, of material of that door, choosing wood. The judges fought for the wood. The designers wanted steel, you know, but imagine what a steel door would say to an ordinary person versus a wooden door, right? And that having more of an African aesthetic.
But maybe you can then just add for me on that, like students who are, and I'm saying students now, who are not able to kind of assess the difference between, I don't know, the Discovery Building and the Constitutional Court, and are wowed by the kind of curvature and the form of thing as a kind of aspirational quality, but I'm not seeing the humane. I mean, it's amazing. I think maybe the more we get online and the more that we work in kind of detached spaces. You called Santon detached. The more detached we're becoming, and the more detached we are from that elderly lady from the rural area, you know, we are getting more and more detached. And what advice do you give to students in becoming more attached, more connected, more empathetic?
You know, having worked in those Santon buildings, that you realize that buildings are storytellers. And you realize that some buildings don't really tell a compelling story. They're not even quite sure what story they're telling. And you realize that buildings they speak to relationship. You know, you make connections to buildings. And for me, I didn't have, the first law firm that I worked at in Santon was before the skyscrapers. It was also quite humble. It felt like a family run law firm. And then we got into this period where it felt like all the law firms were competing as to who can have the biggest and best building in Santon. I felt that shift coming from sort of a smaller, more humble building, you know, that felt a little bit more intentional. And, you know, going to the Constitutional Court. And then by the time I make it back to Santon, it is the culture of the skyscrapers and feeling disconnected. So for me, it's like, you know, more importantly, how do they feel inside those buildings? And I felt like I wasn't seen. You know, there was nothing about this continent that was expressed in those buildings. You know, it didn't feel like we were connected to any higher mission other than making a profit, other than billing hours, because the building didn't say anything to that idea as to what it is we are about. So I felt very lost in that space. And I think I was more aware of it because I just come from this building where everything was so intentional. And that then spoke to how I approach my work. I was very intentional. I was very inspired. You know, I still frequent that building a lot. And, you know, when Nelson Mandela died, that's where I went to pay my respects, because I feel like it embodies the ideas that he stood for, not necessarily him. And for me, that was, you know, I think it's well expressed by the building itself.
Okay, I want to open it up to questions. Either if you want to put a question in the chat or raise your hand.
And just know that I'm a lawyer, guys. I'm not an architect.
But that's what makes it, you know, I think, Lwando, I think as architects, and we listen to conversations of other architects, and we're dealing with issues that need us to break the kind of system we're in. And we need to transform our thinking. And talking to each other, we just talk to echo chambers and we talk, you know, our language. We need to speak to others. We need a different view to kind of break the way we see things.
Yeah. And as a lawyer, I never thought buildings would be important for my work. But, you know, working in a space that was designed to reinforce the kind of legal culture that we want to have, I saw that those two things go hand in hand.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if there are any questions. I can see Tanzim, who was our last speaker last time, is in the house, and so is Professor Ian Lowe. I'm not able to see everyone. The questions about materials and African building materials, and I guess kind of, you know, the question would be also, what is African? Africa's a big place, and
Yeah.
how would you answer that? What is South African? What is African? When you say, you know, the point you make about Mandela entering in traditional dress, bringing in his identity and contrasting, you know, making a point of the contrast of not fitting in.
I mean, in the dress, he literally went for what is his culture as a Xhosa man. He went to wearing the kaross. But I think when it comes to broadness, I think that's when, like, I'm more interested in the process of how buildings are designed, in the sense that, you know, this competition was a public, I mean, the building of the court was a public competition. You know, there were a lot of people that weighed in, even the judges themselves, who are very diverse, who are from diverse backgrounds, you know, and cultures, also weighed in into the process. And also people who'd been incarcerated in colonial prisons and who had been, you know, they're accused in a colonial court, were part of the process. So I think for me, we may not be able to represent every aspect of Africanness, but I think the more diverse group of people you draw into the process of making a building, the better the outcome will be.
Okay, I see there's a question from Tanzim, but I'm going to just read Caitlin's question first. Caitlin's a student, in fact, in our honours here. I really enjoyed the intense reflection on the histories and symbols that we perhaps sometimes do not question critically and have created our own as a response. How did the interaction between designers and the persons of law shift the design from how it started? Or was it more about the smaller things like the door and the finishes? How much impact did the collaborators have between the various people involved? I know you weren't particularly involved in the process of the building, but
I
you do
wish
know
I
the
was.
stories.
I mean, when the court was being built, I was still like in primary school or high school. So what I know from the stories that have been told, and someone like Albie Sachs and Yvonne Mokgoro, who have such a design sensibility, were very much the representatives of the judges. They all deliberated and they all sort of spoke through the two spokespeople who are Albie and Justice Mokgoro. And when you look at Albie's history and Justice Mokgoro's history, those are people who've sort of been around on the continent, who are very much community people, who very much have a human rights background, an activist background. And, from Yvonne Mokgoro's side, her biggest contribution, I think, was seeing the court as a bridge. Whereas apartheid was about walls and building walls in between people, Justice Mokgoro was like, the central location of the court allows the court to build bridges between communities that had been separated before. In the middle of Hillbrow and the West Cliff, you have the court as the bridge between those very two extreme communities, right? So I think the judges were quite poetic in the understanding of how they'd like this building to function and to look. So they were very, very hands-on. I mean, the committee, the design committee, there was that kind of presence. And as I said, of people like Tenjiwe Mtintso, who's a woman who had been incarcerated at the women's jail at Cornhill, and who's a freedom fighter. She's a soldier, actually. And she remembers how her mom felt coming to her court hearings, not being able to use the front door, going to the back door. So those people carry a lot of emotions of what not to do, how a space can make people feel. And I think that's what they brought to the architects, who are quite young, so they were very involved.
Okay. Tanzim, before we go to you, I see Namdi has his hand up. Namdi, if you want to ask your question, please. Namdi is head of school.
Good afternoon. Thank you again, Nabil. Thank you, Patricia and colleagues. Thank you, guests. Thank you, Lwando, for the beautiful lecture. You raised a lot of questions in the lecture. And I'm debating here which ones to touch, but perhaps hearing the way you've spoken, I am not sure that as architectural educated people, we would be able to postulate about the legal origins of this country, as you've been able to postulate outside your profession into the field of architecture with histories of our courts. Thank you for that. In your contrast between the humble court at the Constitution Hill and Sandton, what role does capitalism play as an aspect of modernity? Do you understand that? Is there any separation between that and apartheid, or between that and European culture and capitalism as a global experience that we are all engaging in, of which when you were there from a humble building, then you moved to an scaled building and you could notice the differences. I know, please anywhere you would like to start. Thank you.
Well, I'll say this, that, capitalism and colonialism, even how the East Dutch Company came to make Cape Town or the Cape an outpost, it was all for capitalist endeavors. Them bringing in slaves, or the enslaved from Asia to South Africa to be able to produce and to excavate from people. That is the nature of capitalism. And I think our materialism, our competitiveness, our disconnectedness, is all a product of capitalism as a system that is focused on the individual, focused on a few, and designed to, further inequality amongst people. And it is almost a smokescreen. It's almost elusive, because capitalism tells you if you work hard, if you labor, if you sacrifice yourself in the pursuit of wealth, you will be rewarded. But a lot of what I have seen, even in the Constitutional Court, in terms of the cases that have made it there, is a failure of that promise, where people do work hard, people do go to school, and the returns are unpredictable, they're precarious, as we've seen through COVID. I think capitalism is a product, or is what enabled apartheid and colonialism. I think it's hard to separate those two. And I think how it expresses itself in buildings is pretty much the intimidation of the buildings. They lord over you, how obscene and opulent they have to be as a symbol of success, of material wealth, of doing well. And I think it represents that prevalent thinking in our culture, thinking that capitalism will bring us freedom. If we work hard, it won't.
Yeah, wow.
And a constitution is more of a social democratic constitution that is centered on, people having, the opportunity, and people having the basics, and not having to live such impoverished lives that we see today, where children are still learning under trees, and people don't have proper housing, and people don't have water, and people, are receiving such minimal grants just to make it every month. Whereas our constitution really, it speaks to the idea that, we should all live under humane conditions. And it feels like that's at odds with this capitalistic culture that we have, which has also produced the kind of corruption that we see.
Lwando, thank you for that. One last question from Lemon Pebble. I think it's to Zim Razak.
Hi, Nabil. Hi, Lwando. Thank you very much for quite an inspiring lecture. I really learned from your reading of spatial power, and sometimes as an architect, we take the system of how we design for granted, but we forget that the embedded power of how is it perceived by non-architects, So your reading of it is like it's really revealing. So I really, really appreciate that. But what I'd be really interested to hear about is what I think your response to Namdi answered some of that, is that we have this aspirational value of a building in Sandton. Every day that we have the right of success, the result of success spatially is to work in a high-rise, glamorous building in Sandton. Then you've made it. So as architects, we tend to there's this dichotomy between creating accessible spaces, which usually read as quite humble, not humble, but beautiful with light, but low scale. But what we thought, or the prevalent thinking, is that if you made it, you should be working in a corporate environment, and the best building is the Michelangelo in Sandton. So It's really refreshing to hear your perspective on that. But how would you how would you how would you how would you what would you tell us architects, like what do we do in fighting this aspirational value versus what we really think should be done for an accessible building or a egalitarian building?
Sure, that's a difficult question. I don't think I know how to answer it because maybe the only thing I can speak to is process in the imagining of these buildings. That if I had to think of people that work in that building, it's not only executives. You have people across the spectrum, people who are overlooked when buildings are being made, as if they could not have any valuable insight into what it could look and feel like. So I think the only advice I would have is that for me, the outcome of what the building looks like needs to be justifiable on who was consulted and what inputs were taken into consideration, and who's the person that you had in mind when you were making the building. So I can only speak to process, because for lawyers, process is everything. If your process isn't right, if the consultation is not there, just like in the making of laws, if you don't hear everyone out, then the outcome is considered dubious. And I think maybe, thinking of what those buildings represent to some of us, like for me, it's where you literally feel like it's the boulevard of broken dreams. You arrive there from university all bushy-tailed, and that space becomes a space where you hold into because of capitalistic ambitions of wanting to work hard. So you spend so much time in those buildings, and I think it could have grave consequences on the psyche to spend that much time in a building that did not have in mind that some young person would be arriving here, with their dreams and in pursuit of something, and will spend a lot of their waking moments inside of those buildings, and how it can affect you, psychologically, that space and that pressure that is in that space.
Yeah, I hear you. Lwando, I'm looking through just going to read a few invaluable insights, informative. Thank you for the insights. Interesting. Lots of comment by Van Roy. Inclusivity is probably a good starting point. And this is why we wanted to have you here and share your insights, really. I think what I really take away today is that sometimes architecture, when we build things, we build with this idea of metaphor. This represents this. And usually those metaphors are nonsense. They're kind of things to drive form. But your reading of courts and the history of courts shows us how politicized, how political, how hierarchical, how these things have readings on everyday people, and it is, and we have a kind of power and agency as architects to think inclusively, to think empathetically, and to draw and make empathetically, and with a humanist, a radical humanism. That's what Ian Lowe referred to recently, and that is what we need. Would you agree? Like, what do you think architects need to be focusing on in 2021, Johannesburg, South Africa?
Maybe going back to basics, my final thought was that old woman that you were talking about, how it feels to arrive at the Constitutional Court and to walk through those doors, and how it feels for her to walk through the doors of the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein, which was the highest court in the land under apartheid, which still functions as just a court that's beneath the Constitutional Court in terms of hierarchy. For me, I've watched little children walk up to the court as they're walking from school and heading home, and they stop outside the court and they play on the art fixtures outside of the court. If the court building looked the way that the Supreme Court looks like in Bloemfontein, there's no way they would play on that art. There's no way they'd walk through the door and ask to use the bathroom and have the confidence to say, where's the bathroom? I'd like to use the bathroom. So not only is it a gathering space for people who are coming to listen to the cases, but for the little children, because the court is built next to a primary school, that they feel welcomed enough, putting a smiling face on the justice system. That's expressed through the doors. It's expressed through the Constitutional Court font with its beautiful colors and almost the childlikeness of the font, and also the artwork around the court building, all around the court building. I think the court really, when you walk past it, you feel like it's made an effort, and I think that making an effort to communicate to people who are the least protected, like children or like the old woman from a remote area in South Africa who maybe can't even read but knows how she feels. So I think for me, at a time where, we've been reminded of how separated we are, the distance between us, not just in terms of material wealth, but the physical distance. And, just thinking of how other people have not fared well, under this, in this past year and a half, how a lot of people feel invisible and unseen and forgotten, is that I think architects need to see people and need to see the most marginalized of people. And that needs to be at the center of your work and who you have in mind, that when people walk past your building, even the expression of a different language is kind of like, oh, there's my language. I belong here. There's something of my community, my people, or there's a shared symbol as South Africans, like the amazing, beautiful flag inside the court chamber itself. So I think it's just thinking of the people who are unseen by buildings.
Wow, thank you, Lwando. I've really enjoyed it, and maybe if we can have a warm round of emojis, since we can't have applause. Definitely, Lwando, a fantastic chat and insights, and I hope the students and the architecture fraternity who got to share in these insights appreciate it, and will take some of this home to their drawing boards or to their computers. Thank you very much. I just want to remind, thank you to our attendees for coming.
Sorry, Nabil, can I just share? For people
Sure.
who want to read more about the story of the making of the court, visit ourconstitution.constitutionhill.org.za. You'll find a lot on South African history and a particular focus on how the court was built.
Okay, brilliant. Lwando, thank you. Just to say that the CPD link will be open until 6. I hope everyone's okay with that. If you have a problem, Patricia's just posted it again. And please join us for the 3rd lecture in the series. Our lecture series is forming a narrative. There's a story being told. We're looking at
Do you get the
ideas
notes on Teams on your phone?
Terence, all the dates are on the website, on the SOAP website. The next one is on the 7th of October, on the Thursday at the same time. So, and it's Duzen Dupel, who is a graduate from the architecture school and is now based in Rotterdam with his practice, and is a specialist in sustainability. So that would be a great one not to miss. But thank you everyone for attending, and see you next time. Have a great day. Thank you, Lwando. Much appreciated.